Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Nemesis. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every Star Trek film 1 week at a time. For this video, I will be covering the fourth and last Next Generation film, Star Trek Nemesis. So, if you've been watching this series, if you see my first Contact review, I talked about how at that point, this is, with the exception of Insurrection, but at that point, this is where me and popular opinion part ways. This is probably the most true for this film, because this film is generally considered one of the worst Star Trek movies. In fact, many people would say it is the worst, and would put it even below The Final Frontier, which it just blows my mind that some people have that reaction. But anyway, I actually consider this one of the better Star Trek films. I'll just flat out say it. To me, this is hands down the best Next Generation film. So again, quite a controversial statement that goes against popular opinion. I'm really surprised that opinion has gone that way, and I don't think it wasn't initially like this, at least to my recollection. I remember when I first saw this film, I saw it 3 times, and in the cinemas. That's how much I liked it. And the third time I saw it was like months after it was released. I saw it like at a dollar theater, and the guy working at the theater, it was like, "Oh, this is a good movie, and you get to see it for only $1. What a treat!" And like, some people might think, oh, he was being sarcastic. No, he wasn't being sarcastic. He actually thought it was a great movie, and that's what I generally thought. And going back on IMDb and reading a lot of reviews when the film was first released in 2002, and when it came out on DVD in 2003, most of those reviews were positive. So some time down the years, it seemed to become trendy to hate on this film, and I think it's a piece of shit. Now, to be fair, we all I talked about my brother before. He has his channel, Tanko. He hates this film. He always hated this film from the very beginning, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who did, but I don't know. There is a thing with collectivism where if it becomes popular, hate on something, people tend to lean that way. And I'm not saying that as a dig on anyone. I think we all do it. I do it. Everyone does it subconsciously. Like, if film's considered good or bad, generally, and we don't really put much thought into it, we kind of just unconsciously lean towards the way of popular opinion. But again, I'm just spitballing. I'm just speculating, because I just disagree so much with the opinion that this film is awful. Now, let me get into... Alright, before I do that, I will say for a while I was actually considering this film my second favorite Star Trek film behind Wrath of Khan. Now, I had since adjusted that, because when I look at the film objectively, I can see there are a lot of flaws in it too. I was sort of blinding myself to these flaws because I was so enamored with what works in this film, and I still think what works in this film does overwhelm what doesn't work in the film, but still I have to take these flaws into account, so I since adjusted it. And when I say it's the best Next Generation film, you have to understand that I think all the other Next Generation films aren't that great either, so it's not really that high of a praise. Like, if you see my first Contact reviews, I didn't think as highly of that film as many other people did, because I thought it had a lot of structural issues, which I think Nemesis does not have. So most of those films I thought were averagely good, except for Insurrection, which was just averagely bad. So to say Nemesis, which I think is slightly better than those, so it's not really high praise, but take that for what it is. Anyway, so let me get into some of the background with this film. So I mentioned before in my Insurrection review that the film following First Contact was originally supposed to be called Nemesis, and it was originally supposed to involve the Romulans, and it was originally supposed to focus on Picard and Data. So it seems like since they went a totally different direction with Insurrection, they still had those ideas and they carried them over into this film, so they had that sort of core groundwork already in mind, that it would be called Nemesis and that it would involve like one of the best villains you could ever see, a villain better than Khan, they kept saying. um, and so what they decided to do was get new creative staff. Instead of just working with the same writers, the same directors, they decided to sort of get some new blood involved. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. Like, a lot of people who hate this film will trash it, saying, "Oh, they went outside these people know nothing of Star Trek, blah 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 blah." Well, first of all, that's actually not true of the writer, John Logan. I have saw a couple of reviews and say, "Oh, this guy knows nothing about Star Trek." He's actually a huge Star Trek fan, and this is something I knew before the film came out. This is something I read, they were publicizing, and something I was aware of is that this film was written by a fan. He went out of his way to want to write a Star Trek film. And the other thing I heard about him is, he's a novice, he doesn't really know what he's doing, which is not true, because he wrote the Oscar-winning film Gladiator. Now, it does pain me to say Oscar-winning film because I actually did not like Gladiator, as those familiar with my channel know. So it's not really high praise for me that he wrote that film, which I think is highly overrated and not very good. But it does show that he is a veteran screenwriter, even at this stage, and a Star Trek fan, and knew what he's doing. Now, the choice with director, though, I can't really say I agree with as much or can praise as much, because the director they got was Stuart Bard, who reportedly didn't really like Star Trek, didn't really know anything about Star Trek. A lot of people who hate this film will publicize that he hates Star Trek, so I have to take that with a grain of salt. But he's unfamiliar with Star Trek and was, at the very least, not that enthused about directing a Star Trek film. And Rick Berman, as much as I like to trash him, he actually didn't want Stuart Bard to direct. He wanted Nicholas Meyer. Now this is interesting because Nicholas Meyer said he would do the film if he had control of the script, because I think I talked about this before in Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 6. Nicholas Meyer likes to, he's not a hired gun. He likes to come in and have like full control. He rewrote Wrath of Khan and it was better for it. He rewrote Undiscovered Country and it was better for it. So I think it's a shame that he wasn't able to do the same thing here, because I think if he had directed and he came in and tweaked the script, that not only would I think it's a better film, I think it would have been a well-received film rather than the poorly received film that it was. But the reason why is because Rick Berman had already given script rights to John Logan. So John Logan had contractually had full control over the script. So it was too late. He couldn't actually do that for Nicholas Meyer. And so Nicholas Meyer, well, I'm not going to do it, which is fair enough. I think that's actually a good mindset to have. If I can't have control over the script, and I just don't want to be a hired gun, because every director has a different style. And so I respect that about Myers, but I do think the film would have been way better had they actually had Nicholas Meyer came in. Now, Rick Berman, again, as much as I like to trash him, his second choice after Nicholas Meyer turned it down was LeVar Burton. And LeVar Burton really wanted to direct a Star Trek film as well, but the studio forced him to have Stuart Bard. And it was part of like a contractual deal, because Stuart Bard was a professional editor. He's edited a lot of Hollywood films for Paramount, And so it was part of a deal because they wanted him to do these re-edits on some films. I think Mission Impossible 2 was one of them, and they wanted him to do it uncredited. So, which is usually a no-no because it allows them to pay him less. So, but it was part of the deal because he wanted to direct more films. So they worked out a deal like, okay, if you re-edit those films, we'll give you this Star Trek film that you can direct. And so they made this deal behind like Rick Berman and anyone who's actually involved in Star Trek's backs, and sort of forced this director onto the film. And I do think that the film would have been better for it had they gotten a different director, someone like LeVar Burton, who understood Star Trek, or even better, Nicholas Meyer. But that being said, I don't think, because this guy directed it sucks. Because I think he was wanting to do a good job. He was wanting to direct a good film. But he was more of just a hired gun. And he's not someone who understood Star Trek very well. And I'll get more into this later. And it's very well known, well publicized that he got everyone's names wrong. He kept calling LeVar Burton Laverne, and that was really pissing him off. And apparently he thought Geordi LaForge was an alien, didn't realize that he was blind and had implants. So the guy was kind of clueless, but I don't think that makes this a bad film. I don't think that makes him a bad director. I think he was trying to do his best to be a hired gun, but he was basically a hired gun, so it let some things slip, which I'll get to later, but I don't think this makes it a bad film. So one misconception that I heard some reviewers say that this was the first film he directed and he had no idea how to direct and didn't know what he was doing, which is actually not true. As I said, he was a veteran editor. He's edited tons of Hollywood films, but he had directed 2 films before directed this one. He directed U.S. Marshals, which people might have forgot. It's a sequel to The Fugitive, which it was okay, I guess. And he also directed Executive Decision, which I actually really liked. I really enjoyed that movie. It was like a political intrigue action film where these people have to use this stealth technology to board a plane. So this military team boards a plane that's been hijacked, and Kurt Russell plays this CIA agent who was just along for the initial riot, but because something goes wrong, he has to go onto the plane, and the big military leader of this military attack team was Steven Seagal. His character dies pretty much at the start of the film, which was pretty ballsy move, and so it's actually really, and Halle Berry's in this film too, so it's actually a decent movie. I actually enjoyed that movie, and I think he even Stephen Barrett talks about in the commentary how filming that film helped prepare him for Nemesis. He had the scene where he did a decompression on the bridge of the Enterprise, and he also had a decompression scene on the airplane in the Executive Decision, saying how that experience helped with that. It's just so I think it's a good directing job. I wouldn't say it's a bad directing job, but I will say that the film would have benefited more for someone who's more familiar with Star Trek and more familiar with the tone of Star Trek. But then again, I think that problem was worse in Star Trek 2009. Now, I did this whole video. I'm trying not to get too much into comparisons between Nemesis and 2009, but I can't help myself. I already did a whole video about this. You can watch it. Star Trek Nemesis is better than Star Trek 2009, because generally speaking, this film is considered garbage, and Star Trek 2009 is considered awesome. Even the people like myself who hate the reboots, a lot of them will say, well, Star Trek 2009 was okay, it's Into Darkness that sucked, which I totally disagree with. I think 2009 was the giant piece of garbage, but I'll get more into that next week. So I can't help comparing the two of them, and in regards of it not feeling like Star Trek, Nemesis has nothing on 2009. 2009 does not feel at all like Star Trek. And not only was it the director who didn't know anything about Star Trek, the writers didn't know anything about Star Trek either. Whereas at least in this case, the writer was a huge Star Trek fan, and you do have that Star Trek feel come through in the script. So I wouldn't say this is missing the Star Trek feel. I think it would have benefited more simply from a director who's more familiar with Star Trek, which isn't the same thing. But regardless, and the other thing about this film is historically it is the Star Trek film that is made the least amount of money, box office wise. It was the biggest flop. Now that had a lot to do with when it was. This was just. I think it was very poorly handled by the studio. Like, I like the shit on Rick Berman, and I was just talking about the director sort of misplaced, but I think the main issue is the studio interference is what sort of damaged this film. First of all, by forcing that director onto the film, where they should have had LeVar Burton or someone more familiar with Star Trek. But the other thing is the release date. This film was released in, like, I think December, either early December or late November of 2002, which is sandwiched in between the release of the second Harry Potter film and the second Lord of the Rings film. And there were a few other major blockbusters coming out in those same month as well. That's stupid. Of course it flopped. And I think if it had better word of mouth, maybe it would have done okay and not done the worst. But I think the fact that they got such a negative reaction from people added to the woes. But I do think the film, even as is, if it was released in like August or like March or something like that, it would have done a lot better, way better actually in my opinion, than it had, because people were like, oh, what's on? Nothing's really on. Oh, there's this new Star Trek movie, let's go see that. Whereas you release it in December and people are like, oh, let's go see Harry Potter, let's go see Lord of the Rings. Oh, this is Star Trek, who cares about that? See, that's stupid. That's just dumb. And the studio should know better. That Star Trek has never been like it. First Contact made a lot of money. Voyage Home made a lot of money, but Star Trek films have never been huge blockbuster driving thing. Well, except for 2009, but I'll get to that. It's never been huge driving forces that make money making machines that make a lot of money that drive people to the cinema. There's not like they can't compete with like titans like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. It was stupid for them to try. Now you could say, well, maybe they didn't realize those other films were released when they set the release date. Well, as soon as they found out, they should have moved the fucking thing. They should have moved it to like February of next year or something. Like this it's just stupid. And so there's no reason, there's no doubt that it would bomb so badly. And so when people point to, oh, this bombed the worst movie, that means that shows how terrible the movie is. It has less to do with how terrible the movie is and more to do with how bad that release date was and how stupid the studio was. The studio just... Anyway, I think I talked about that one enough. So, let me get into my opinion of this film. So I'll structure this as we'll get into the good and the bad. I'll start with the bad because, as I said, I do have to acknowledge that there are faults to this film. It's not the perfect film that I was hoping it would be, and there's things that just did not work and could have done better. So let me get those out of the way first. Let me get to the things about these films that didn't work. First of all, the Jeep chase scene. That is stupid. Every time I watch it, I'm just like, it's such an obvious like attempt at having a cool action scene, and it doesn't add anything. So they go to this planet because they find like traces of positronic like something, whatever. So another data basically. So they go to this planet, they find the B4, which I'll get to later, and all of a sudden, these aliens start chasing them on jeeps. Oh, and they decide, like Picard decides, they call it the Argo, but it's basically like a jeep. And they decide to take it down and go riding around the planet for... Why? Why are they doing this? I don't know. But anyway, they go for a ride and they find the B4. And then all of a sudden they're attacked by these other aliens who also just so happen to be on jeeps. and they start chasing them and firing guns at them, and they have this chase scene, and then at the end they have this unnecessary jump. It was basically like jumping the shark, really, where the Jeep jumps over the cliff and goes into the shuttle. Why do these aliens have jeeps? Why are these aliens chasing them? Why are they shooting at them? Why did the Picard decide to take the jeep? Why are they taking this huge jump? I mean, I can just imagine. Like, I don't know. I kind of have a better opinion of John Logan. I haven't, even though like I know he had final decision on the script. It's hard for me to believe that he would have the script written like this. To me, this screams, and this is all speculation, but to me, this screams studio interference. I reckon that the original script was they beam down to the planet, they find B4, and they beam back up, and maybe have a few lines, and the studio heads read this like, oh, this is boring, we need to spice this up, we need more action, let's put in a chase scene, let's have these aliens in a Jeep, let's have them go in a Jeep in high speed, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's all speculation, but that's what totally screams to me. Like, it's very obvious. And again, I talked about this in my comparison to 2009. 2009 also has a scene like this. So, again, much like the scene with the monsters on the planet, like that was just as bad and gratuitous as this one was. But regardless. Anyway, the other scenes I have to talk about, which because they're often brought up to say why this movie sucks, and I agree these scenes are kind of unnecessary. Well, not kind of, really unnecessary, I should say. They're what are referred to by the director himself as, and the commentary refers to them as rape scenes, where Counselor Troy is like mentally raped, or she's mentally attacked. First of all, we get like a sex scene between Riker and Troy. Why? Yeah, I read online that Jonathan Frakes refused to have his back shaved for the scene, so they had to digitally remove his back hairs. That's funny. Anyway, I mean, don't get me wrong, Jonathan Frakes and Marina Sirtis have aged gracefully. We should all be so lucky. But still, they're a bit old at this stage, and we don't really need to get a sex scene. It's kind of like watching your parents have sex, kind of, in that same vein, because the Troy and Riker relationship has always been like something that was really pure and heartfelt, and to see them try to sex it up like that, but more than that, they interrupt it by having this mental like attack, or mental rape is how they refer to it, where Troy is attacked by Shinzon, and it never really explained why. Very clearly why Shinzon is doing this. Like, Shinzon and Viceroy, like, they make a point out of doing it. And so you get the feeling that they're not just doing it for the kicks, that it's part of the plan for some reason. Maybe they wanted to glean some information for Troy. Maybe it's kind of similar to the episode Survivors, where they want to knock her, keep her off balance, so that she doesn't sense what they're up to, which is actually what I think it is. But I think they could have made that a bit more clear on why they was doing. But regardless, like, this whole thing, they could have done without it. It was unnecessary. But that being said, and it's really gratuitous too to try to sex up rape is very, 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 very bad. I mean, they try to make up for it later on by having Troy be the one to find Shinzon in the big battle, so she uses that connection that he formed with her against him, which I actually thought was cool, but doesn't justify having this. Like, I think they should have done without it. It is really in poor taste. Let's say that. But that being said, I've seen some other reviews that say, oh, this is extremely un-Star Trek-like, which I actually went the other way. When I first saw this movie, I was like, wait, they already did this. This is something they've already done. In fact, in the film, Troy refers to it as a violation. And this is a hamper back to the Next Generation episode called Violations, where the exact same thing happens. You have this guy who comes on board, and he mentally rapes Troy, Riker, and Crusher. And so you could say it was an homage to that. I think I would say it's more of a ripoff. It's too similar to it. So yeah, my reaction wasn't, oh, this isn't Star Trek. My reaction is, this has already been done before. They're just redoing something that's already been done before and spicing it up. Which, I don't know, you could argue that Violations, that episode, also tried to spice it up because it did a lot of cool, fancy camera moves. But I don't know, something about the way it was done here feels a slightly bit more sexed up, which is, no. 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 You don't do that. But still, it is something that they've done before, and why are they doing it again? And it's just rehashing unnecessary. So either way, this whole thing, you could have done without it. Now let's get to Data's death, because this is a big point of contention that me and my brother had, because he was a very strong component of Nemesis is the ripoff of Wrath of Khan. He would say even more so than Into Darkness, which I'm directly quoting him from one of my last videos that I did. So I don't want to speak for him because he's not here. But basically, this is what I remember him saying. But basically, yeah, I kind of disagree with that. But Data's death scene, to me, is a direct ripoff of Khan, but he would say the whole movie is a ripoff of Khan, which I actually disagree, and I'll get more into when I get into Shinzon, because I think, even though I do think he is definitely based off of Khan, they definitely inspire from it. I think they take it in a different direction to make it more justifiable than Into Darkness, or even Star Trek 2009, which I think Nero was way more of a direct ripoff of Khan, but again, I'll get to that next week. But anyway, the Data's death scene to me is the only thing that was a direct ripoff of the Wrath of Khan, and that's why it doesn't work. Like if the Wrath of Khan never happened and it didn't already exist, then I would actually be kind of fine with this scene. Now, I've always put the scene down because it felt very rushed. It felt like Data's this very important character who was important to the Star Trek franchise and who to the film actually had been building up throughout the film's run, and then he's just dead and they cry and that's it. So it seems to go whoosh, like they seem to glide over the fact that this major character who's an important part of our lives just died. So in that sense, it felt kind of tacked on. Now, I did, similar to the Wrath of Khan, I actually read that the actor who portrayed this character, in this case Brent Spiner, wanted the character to die. Like in Wrath of Khan, Leonard Nimoy wanted Spock to die, and here Brent Spiner wanted Data to die. And his reasoning was that he was getting older, and Data is supposed to be an ageless android, so it doesn't really make sense for Data to age, so he wanted to sort of end the character. But it turns out Data didn't actually have to die for this to happen, because Data wouldn't be in anything else after this anyway. And in fact, had they done more movies, Brent Spiner admitted that he would have came back anyway. And it's also similar in the terms of Wrath of Khan, where they set themselves an out. Like the Wrath of Khan had, Spock do the mind meld with McCoy. Here they had the thing with B4, where Data downloaded everything, essentially everything in him to B4. So it's very obvious, and they were setting this up at the end of the film, that they were setting it up so that B4, Data's programming would take over B4, so basically Data would become, B4 would become Data again, which is what happened in the novelizations, the non-canon novels that took place after this, because that was very obviously where they were. So had there been more films and stuff, that's obviously what they would have done anyway. So that also kind of undercuts the death a bit. But I don't know, I still put this in my negatives, but when I watched this film last night, I could kind of appreciated the death scene a bit more, because I can actually get the subtleness that they were going to. They weren't going to, hit you over the head. They didn't want to have, a huge funeral like they did for Wrath of Khan and Picard crying, he was the most human. I mean, that would be too much of a ripoff, but still, point is, they didn't want to make a huge deal out of it, and something about the subtle way that he sacrifices himself. He just, puts the transporter thing and says goodbye, and the way that the crew are simply just shed a tear and they drink, and Riker's like, "You remember that time I was in the holodeck?" Like, there's something about those scenes, actually watching them again last night, that worked. That the fact that they didn't dwell too much on this death actually has this good subtle side to it. But again, as I said, I'm still putting this in the negatives because this is a great character. You can't just blow through his death like that. You need to have more do. But I do get what they were trying to do, and I think they did pull that off well. And just disagree with their decision to go that route. Put it that way. And the other thing is the music. Now, I talked about this a lot in each of my previous Star Trek Next Generation film reviews, how I hate the music in Nemesis, and watching this again, I think this is the worst aspect of the film. It's funny because I read this one review on IMDb, this user review, and it said, "Oh, good music, but the rest of the film sucks." Whereas me, I had the exact opposite reaction. A lot of the film was good, but the music sucked. Now, I think this, again, is a sign that has more to do with Stuart Bird not knowing Star Trek very well. Because Jerry Goldsmith is a good composer, but I think, and has noted with some of his other Star Trek collaborations, he needs to be reined in by the director. You can clearly see this in Star Trek The Motion Picture, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, where the show Bob Weiss had to clearly rein in Jerry Goldsmith and be like, you need to adjust this music, adjust that to make it fit this film better. And I have no doubt that actually happened with Jonathan Frakes and First Contact, because his music was fairly decent in that film as well. Was really good at parts. So I have no doubt that the director worked with him to sort of rein it in, and I have no doubt that Stuart Bird didn't work with him at all, because he was just a hired gun. He didn't really get the point of Star Trek and he didn't get the feel of the film. So the music is really all wrong in this film. It's hard for me to put into words, but it feels like a 60s melodrama. It feels like it's sort of like a kid's science fiction or a 70s science fiction, or something that's very simplistic and cliche, which is never what Star Trek should be. Star Trek is more complex. Star Trek is more involved, and the music, particularly in the first scene, in the opening scene with the Romulan Senate and the Romulans, that's the music that always gets me, and that's the opening scene, so that leaves a bad impression to begin with, when the music's like dun 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 dun. It's just so cheesy and over the top. And there's other, sometimes the music works, like during the space battle scene. I think the music works at times, but then it will be like this good tense that you need, but then all of a sudden it will go back into the cheesy level, particularly with the fight scene between Shinzon and Picard, where all of a sudden the music goes dun 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 dun, and it just it's 60s, childish, very cheesy. So I think this is something that could have been corrected had they actually had a director who was more enthused about this project, who was more familiar with Star Trek, like a Nicholas Meyer or a LeVar Burton. I have no doubt, had they had a more involved director, that the music is one of the main points that would have been better. And for that matter, the costuming. The costuming could have been better. Shinzon's outfit was really cheesy. It kind of reminds me of the Xindi outfits that had in Enterprise. Now, this movie came out during Enterprise second season, so the Enterprise third season would be the year after, where they introduced the Xindi reptilians, and they too had ridiculous costuming, which I think looked a bit too silly over the top. And I think it was the same thing here with the Remans. I like the look of the Remans, though, like their makeup, but the costuming, you could have done a better job with that. Now, before I get to the good, there's one thing I want to mention I forgot to mention before, which is pretty interesting, is that the original plan, because this film was always publicized as the last Next Generation film, which it did end up being, mainly because it bombed. But the original plan was that they were going to do another film after this, but it wasn't going to be a Next Generation film. It was going to be a film which involved characters from the Next Generation, characters from Deep Space Nine, and characters from Voyager. And they were all going to, be involved in this plot, so they'd all have their separate plots, but all come together like an ensemble piece, like a Lord of the Rings or something like that. To me, that sounds awesome. If it was done right, I mean, I could easily see it being a disaster if it's not done right. But if they did it right, that's a pretty awesome concept. Like they'd have Riker on the Titan, and they have Picard on the Enterprise, and then maybe like some DS9 characters, not necessarily on Deep Space Nine. They could have, because the Deep Space Nine characters all split up, so they could have O'Brien and Bashir on some other ship or something like that, and then also have some Voyager characters mixed in that, and that sounds awesome. I think they could have done something great with that, but because this movie flopped, that never got made, unfortunately, which is a damn shame. I just wish this could be an alternate history where they didn't give John Logan sole rights to the script, so they got Nicholas Meyer to come in. Nicholas Meyer directed, made a great film, fans loved it, and the studio wasn't so stupid to release it at a bad point, and this film could have been a smash hit, and then we would have gotten the next film. I want to live in that universe. But anyway, we got what we got. So, and the other thing I want to talk briefly about is some of the cameos, because we got. Now, I talked a bit about Worf because, and as I said, Worf went to Deep Space Nine after the film Generations, and so they kept having to make excuses for him popping up on these Next Generation films. Now, here, this film came out several years after Deep Space Nine finished, and at the end of Deep Space Nine, Worf got promoted to Klingon ambassador. Federation ambassador to Kronos, basically, so you could hang out with Martok. Now, I remember before this film came out, I read some interviews with John Logan, who was writing the script, and he said purposely that he went back and watched the final episodes of Deep Space Nine to try to tie in why Worf would be on the Enterprise. So, after reading that article, I was pretty shocked when I went and saw the film, and Worf was simply there with no explanation whatsoever. He's just there, and some people think this is the worst case. He was supposed to be Klingon ambassador, but no, he's there. Now, but apparently, I read recently that there is a deleted scene where Worf doesn't say he's at the wedding and he's drunk, and he explains, Geordi or someone comes up to him and asks, "Oh, I thought you were like a Klingon ambassador," whatever. And he's like, "Nah, being Klingon ambassador just wasn't for me." And so that'd be it. That'd be the one line that would explain why. So apparently it's going to explain that he didn't like being the ambassador, so he quit and joined the Enterprise. I don't think that, I mean, that kind of makes it a little bit better, but it's still not really that great of an explanation. There was a series of novels, non-canon novels, that actually tried to fill in a lot of the plot holes regarding Nemesis. And one of them was with Worf, and I actually like this explanation a hell of a lot better, is that there was a scene where Worf, there's this whole deal with the Klingons and the conundrum, whatever, and involved his son Alexander. And at the end of it, I can't remember what happened. It's been years since I read these books, but at the end of it, Alexander actually, he gives him the role of Federation ambassador, and Worf returns to Starfleet and goes on board of the Enterprise. That's awesome. They would have found a way to work that in, because the whole thing, what they did with Alexander on Deep Space Nine was so stupid, where all of a sudden they changed his character. He wants to be a Klingon warrior again. That was so dumb. And because from the Next Generation series, he's always seen that Alexander was, in fact, they had a future timeline where he was the Federation ambassador to Kronos. So it makes perfect sense to keep in line with that timeline. They have Alexander take over for Worf, and Worf goes back to Starfleet, because that's the way it should be. But anyway, I guess it just shows like these, the fans who write the non-canon material know more sometimes about Star Trek than the actual writers do. But anyway, the other thing that the novel sort of corrected was, let me get into this Data's emotion chip, because I touched on this a bit before with Insurrection and stuff, that Brent Spiner didn't like the emotion chip, and usually they came up with excuses of why, like either they turned it off or he didn't take it with him, which is total bullshit. Where here it's just gone. There's no explanation. There's no emotion chip. What emotion chip? That never existed. Which, again, I think it shows that Brent Spiner's not that good of an actor. He should be able to work with it. But regardless, they at least should have came out with an explanation. But again, the novels, non-canon novels, came up with this reason why Data wouldn't have this emotion chip, and it's because he got into this issue with Starfleet. They had he got in trouble and they wanted to court-martial him or wherever, but they came to a plea deal where he got to keep his commission, but he had to remove his emotion chip. Again, I guess that explains away the plot hole of what happened to the emotion chip, but, whatever. And the other thing is Wesley makes a cameo. He just shows up. He's in the wedding reception. He doesn't have any dialogue. He's just there. Now, apparently there were some deleted scenes. He was supposed to be in the film more. We don't know what his involvement was going to be, but he's wearing a Starfleet uniform, which kind of makes no sense. Because last time we saw him, he was off traveling with the Traveler. So a lot of people were calling that out. So this novel came up with, to my mind, is a very lame excuse of he shows back up on the Enterprise because he makes himself human again temporarily because he's visiting the human realm or whatever. But when he comes up, he's naked. So they're like, oh, we have to give you some clothes. So I don't know. Picard's like, oh, we have this lieutenant uniform lying around. Why don't you just wear that? And they make a joke out of it. That's a bit lame. And then also we had another cameo where Guinan appears. I think she actually has a line of dialogue. Fine, whatever. I mean, it's all good callbacks. But they don't really do much with these characters. Now, the funny thing is, when I remember hearing interviews with John Logan when he was writing the script, he was like, no, I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm going to include all these things fans will like. But what they mean by that, basically, is just a lot of references. Like at the start of the film, the Romulan ambassador says, oh, I have a meeting with the Tholian ambassador. We're supposed to be like, oh, I know who the Tholians are. Oh, it's so awesome. That's just like the whole Tholians, you know who they are. That happens name drops so many times during Next Generation Deep Space Nine. Oh, Tholian. So it's nothing new. So I don't really care about that. And having let's have Wesley appear for no reason. Let's have Guinan appear and have a couple lines. To me, that's not really good enough to be like, see, I'm a Star Trek fan. I included these cameos. But anyway, let me get now into the good. Why I say I like this film and what I think about this film really works, and what I actually think the good outweighs the bad in this particular case. First of all, let's talk about the Romulan political climate. I really like this. I love this. Is the first time not the first time, because we explored a bit in the Unification, some other stuff, but for the most part, the Romulans were just these shady guys out doing different things. And then, of course, there was that Deep Space Nine episode that I talked about. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name again, which was based off of the original script for the original Nemesis. But anyway, I love getting deeper into this political makeup. Now, the whole idea with the Remans, I was a bit iffy about, and to be honest, I'm still a bit iffy about that they necessarily need to introduce the Remans, but it does bring in an interesting aspect, because it had been established way back since the original series that there was two planets, twin planets, Romulus and Remus, and so, but they just made up that, oh well, if there's a Remus, maybe there's a species native to that planet called Remans. And so I think the concept sounds dumb to me, but the way that they did it, they made it work for this film, that they were an underclass, they would use slave labor. So I think it does bring an interesting dynamic. And then basically the coup on Romulus is due to political situation, because you have the military are a bit more sort of gung-ho, and after the Dominion War, they're wanting to take a more aggressive stance against the Federation, so making sort of analogies between the relations between the U.S. and the USSR after World War II, because they were allies during World War II, but then the tensions raised between them after that, and they're kind of saying the same thing with the Federation and the Romulans, because they were allies against the Dominion, but then after they defeated the Dominion, they're sort of get into, you know what I'm saying, getting more conflict. And I love the way that was handled. And they throw in, so they have these military Romulan leaders who want a more aggressive turn, so they support the Riemann uprising and the Riemann because they come to an agreement that, and this is where I think John Logan's really good script writing comes in. The whole political stage really is set really well, where you have they basically kill off the entire Romulan leadership, and then to put the Remans in place, and so the Remans and the military, who have this uneasy alliance, can head in and make Romulans stronger again. And so it's a very poor sort of situation. But then you have this other commander, Dinatra, who actually does want what's best for Romulus. She can see how just going over and destroying the Federation is not going to be the best thing for Romulus. So she's sort of trying to be the voice of reason. And then you have these different, you have that guy from 24. I can't remember the character he played in 24, but anyway, I recognize him for 24. He's playing the other Romulan military guy, and who keeps trying to assert power over Shinzon, but Shinzon's like, no, fuck you. I'm the one with the power now. You gave me the power. You have to listen to me. So it's a very uneasy alliance. And I think all those scenes between them really work, except for that music, but I already talked about that. But anyway, just the way they were written, the political intrigue aspect of this film is beautiful. And the way it's resolved at the end, where Dinatra actually defects and helps Picard and implies that they are actually going to lead to stronger relations between the Federation and Romulus. This is something I would have liked to see more, to see how this continues onward. Don't get me started on that 2009 bullshit, which is kind of actually taking out for that. But again, I'll get to that next week. Fuck that movie. Anyway, so that I think really worked. Now, let me get to the main thing I think worked about this film, is the villain, the Nemesis. Now, I do think, and I said this before and I stick by this, that they kept trying to redo Khan, and they would have been better off had they stopped trying to make this villain that's just like Khan, stop being like, here's this awesome villain, he's out for revenge. That being said, if they had to do this, which they had to because Berman and the others kept forcing this upon them, I think this is the best possible iteration. I think John Logan did an amazing job writing this character, and more to the point, Tom Hardy did an absolute amazing job playing this character. Now, again, Tom Hardy, you should all know who Tom Hardy is, because he's become a huge movie star. Since recent years, he was nominated for Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor a few years back for The Revenant. He's been Bane in Dark Knight Rises. He was in Inception. He starred as Mad Max in Mad Max Fury Road. He's been in a lot of other films, so he's become quite a huge movie star. And I watched this review. To be fair, this review came out 4 or 5 years ago, and they were like, "Oh, I don't know who this actor is, but he's not very good." Now, to be fair, even I've seen a couple of videos from Schmo's Nose and places like that where they say, the best and worst of Tom Hardy, and they always say that Nemesis is worse. They always put Nemesis in the category of one of his worst films, which I obviously very strongly disagree with, and I'd actually put this in one of his best performances. I think because it's said that this is his first film. So he was saying this as his big break, and apparently I don't know, this could be just rumor bullshit, but apparently he got into a really deep depression after this film bombed. He thought his career was dead, but then, it got revived later, a decade later. But anyway, I thought he did an amazing job in this film, but the point is that he saw this as his big break, so he was putting his all into the role. And you can tell it. And he, even though this is early in his career, he is a great actor. And you can tell that he is trying his best. And I think he does a damn good job. Maybe if he had a better costume, again, but the scenes between him and Patrick Stewart, amazing. I mean, you got two great actors. You have Patrick Stewart and you have Tom Hardy, and you have them in together. Just these, the scene when they go to dinner, and the whole. And I'll get into this later, but the whole structure of his storyline about how he's introduced, and he's this dark figure. You don't know who he is. You find out he's a clone of Picard, and that just brings up this tension. And you see that he's trying to learn more about Picard so he can learn more about himself. But then he has this like twisted obsession with Picard because he sees him as the lesser version of himself, so he wants it eliminated. That is an amazing storyline. That is way more complex and complicated than the simple revenge. Oh, you killed my wife, so now I'm going to kill you. Like it worked with Khan. Don't get me wrong, but they didn't rehash that, which is why I disagree respectfully with my brother who thinks this whole thing is a rehash of Khan. It's not. The dynamic they came up with Shinzon is a lot more complex than just rehashing Khan like 2009 does with Nero, which is just a rehash. Oh, you killed my wife. I'm gonna kill that character. And I'll get into that more next week. But anyway, like Shinzon is like, oh my god, like leaps and bounds better than Nero. And I said this when I was comparing this to 2009, my video for that, is that this is like probably the biggest disparity. It's like night and day. It's like totally awesome to totally suck. Shinzon, and I read this review that came out around the time the movie was released saying Shinzon is the best Star Trek villain since Khan, and I have to agree. Well, maybe if you put in Dukat, but whatever. But movie villains, like when I did my top 5 movie villains, like I think Shinzon was number 2 behind Khan. So I think the way he was written, the way he was acted, the way his story unfolds, his motivation, like the dark sort of presence, like the you want this hindrance, this villain who's dynamic, who you understand, who's not just twirling his mustache, and you understood his plight. You actually sympathize with him to some degree because he came from a very rough upbringing. He was a slave, and he was taken in by the Remans, and they trusted him, and so he has this relationship with the Remans. He has a bond with them, and he became like this war commander who used his power to become the leader. But because of like some of the twisted ways he was brought up, he has this desire to like put violence to wipe out people. He wants to get rid of Picard because he sees him as he can't truly be himself while Picard still exists, and in that fashion he needs to wipe out the entire Federation for that same reason, because he sees them as the forgotten like parents that abandoned him or whatever. And so that all works so well, and that's one of the main reasons why I love this film so much, and why I was willing to overlook those flaws, and why I still think this outweighs the flaws. But I'm not done with my positives. We also get Picard and Data. Like, their dynamic in this film was so well. I think it was better in First Contact. It was better in Generations. I think they really played off of... Now, some people may disagree because Riker's really the first officer initiative, and he got kind of put to the side when they focused more on Data. But let's be real here. Data has always been the more of the fan favorite. And so we really, and maybe some of the other supporting characters don't get their play, like Michael Dorn complained Worf was hardly in it, which is fair enough, but he was hardly in the Next Generation most of the episodes, to be fair. And they want to focus on the heart, on the core, which is Picard and Data, and they do an amazing job at that. You really get a sense of the relationship. You get... And also, like, the dual issues, how the issues they're going through mirror each other, because Picard's dealing with this clone of himself, which is a younger version of himself, and Data meets a prototype android. And the contrast between those two storylines mirroring each other, and then Data having to sort of tell Picard, because Picard's doubting himself, well, if I was raised differently, would I turn out as this homicidal maniac just like Shinzon? And Data's like, well, no, because it's the same thing with B4. Like, he's like me, but he is not me. It's a different sort of person. And to see them bond on that level, and just like the whole way the relationship worked out from when they were on Shinzon's ship and they were trying to fight their way to get out, and Data was pretending to be B4, and they were just working together. And from there, Data's like showing how much he cares about Picard. He's like, use this transporter thing to go back to the Enterprise. Picard's like, no, we have to do it together. And then how that pays off at the end, where Data just slaps it on him and forces him to go back and sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise. Like, that whole structure worked so well, and you really get the strong character, the type of relationship that they have. So that whole thing was amazing. Now, I know a lot of people like to shit on B4 because they'll bring up lore, like, oh, they're just doing lore again. It's kind of different than lore. I will admit it's probably, I don't know, it wouldn't be my first choice, but I think they didn't make it work. I think it did really work for the film. Now, a lot of people complain, oh, they didn't even mention lore. Why do they need to mention lore? Just so they can satisfy your fandom? Hey, this is the second android before lore. Get that, fans? I mean, that seems like the only reason to do that. It's not really necessary for the plot, so I don't care that they didn't mention it. As I touched on, this film has really good structure, good structured pacing, well paced. I know some people say, oh, it gets boring when they're on Romulus and Picard and Shinzon are having this dinner. It's boring. I totally disagree. I think I don't want to be insulting, but I'll just say I totally disagree. I think a good structured plot will have those characters, strong character moments to build up them. And it's what I was saying before. It's why Shinzon isn't just a two-dimensional character. And those scenes between Patrick Stewart and Tom Hardy, superb again. And so you have scenes like that they earn the ending. They earn even though people complain about Data dying being too rushed, they earn that with having that fresh relationship between Picard and Data and building that and having the interaction between Shinzon and Picard. He's not just a mustache twirling villain. You get his motivations, and they earn the battle sequence, which leads me to the next thing. Why I like this film so much. The battle scenes at the end, I'm going to say it, the best battle sequence in all of Star Trek. My opinion, of course, but I stick by that, and I always stick by that. It was this is what really enthralled me about the film. After seeing this film for the first, and that's why I wanted to see it multiple times, because this battle sequence was just superb. It was not just Star Trek films, well, almost any film, really. It was one of the best. It really enthralled me. It was really engaging. It was really suspenseful. Now, you might just say, oh, that's why you like this film, dumb action. It's not dumb action, it's smart action. It's character-based action. Because the reason why this action works so well is because you are invested in the characters. You are invested between this feud between Picard and this dynamic villain, Shinzon, and you're invested in the stakes that he wants to wipe out the Federation, which, to be fair, could have been explained upon a bit more. But you do get the sense that he is twisted, not just because he's crazy like Nero is in 2009, but because of him being brought up as a slave, because of him being befriended by the Remans, because of his feeling of abandonment of the Federation, because of his negative connotations of the Federation during the Dominion War. This all makes perfect sense and adds up to his feelings of wanting to wipe out the Federation. And you have Picard, on the other hand, who sees the mirror of himself, of Shinzon, but the differences, and uses that against him. And this is why these action sequences are so amazing, because the best parts of Next Generation was when Picard was able to outthink his enemies. Like, one of my favorite Next Generation episodes is Survivors, because Picard was just the man. He was on to things. He was figuring everything out. That's how it was here with the Shinzon. At first, he was outnumbered, outgunned. He had this, Shinzon had that huge ship that could overpower the Enterprise. So Picard had to outsmart him. And one of my favorite scenes is when, after they blow up the bridge and they decompresses, and the scimitar is totally, it's fine, and LaForge even says, "There's no way we can defeat them. They've got us beat." And they have the scimitar comes up right in front of the Enterprise E, where the wall is gone, so there's not even a view screen there, and they can see the ship, and Picard's like, I know what he's doing. He's letting his ambition, his feeling of confidence get him. I know that because I would do the same thing. I remember feeling that way. And he says, we've got him. That was such an amazing moment because they're like getting their asses kicked and they're completely like done for. And Picard says, we got him. That was so intense. And then he just rams the freaking Enterprise. God, that scene gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Just how amazing that scene playing out when that was one of the most intense action sequences in any film ever, in my opinion. And I just love it. I cannot understand how people can trash this film and speak so poorly when it has such an amazing scene like that. When he just takes the Enterprise, rams it to the scimitar, and totally changes. He takes a defeat and turns it into a win because he knows Shinzan, because he knows himself. That is dynamic. That is complex. That is rich. That is great storytelling. Now, I will grant you the stuff with Riker fighting the Viceroy was a bit stupid. And again, kind of like the Jeep chase thing. But that doesn't take up too much time. It doesn't detract. And then, of course, you have Picard going to the scimitar to deal, because it totally makes sense that he feels he needs to finish it because he's taking it personally, because this is a version of him that's doing this. But Data is not going to let him because, again, it earned that feeling. The close relationship is betrayed how close Picard and Data was, and how Data's not going to let him sacrifice himself. Data's going to do it for him. And again, like the battle sequence, music aside, between Picard and Shinzan was really well played, really intense. You didn't get like, oh, this is old man fighting a young man and it looks cheesy, like you do with some of the Kirk battle scenes in Undiscovered Country. No, it actually works. It feels realistic, feels natural. You can, because of all the emotion and tension that they built up to it. And the final scene where Picard kills Shinzan by having that pipe, and Shinzan just moves on the pipe and gets right up to Picard's face. And it's like, I'm so glad we can have this moment together. That was such a great death scene. That, I mean, it is kind of some people saying it's kind of ripping off Fellowship of the Ring, which came out the year before, because the main orc guy did this kind of the same thing. When Aragorn killed him, he took the sword and went up like that. But I think, that aside, I think it still really works, and it's an amazing moment between these two characters, because even after he's been defeated, even when he's dying, he just says, I'm glad we could have this moment together. You know, and that's also part taunting, because he's still thinking that they're going to kill, that weapon's going to go off and wipe out the Enterprise. It was just so good. It was just so good. Now, granted, I already talked about Data's death. That could have been handled a bit better. They could have spent more time. It did seem a bit of an afterthought. But again, as I said, like the quiet subtlety of Data just putting it on, saying, you go and live, I'll take care of this, was nice. So I'm sorry, I absolutely love that battle scene. I think there's no battle scene in Star Trek, anything, Deep Space Nine, First Contact, whatever, that is better than that. That is hands down the best battle sequence. And that alone, to me, makes this the best Next Generation film. Anyway, and it was a nice fitting ending, how it ends with Picard saying goodbye to Riker, because Riker finally goes off to be captain, which he should have done a long time ago. Let's be real, but at least they're finally taking care of that. And to see that, there was a really touching scene, especially after they've both been through Data's death together, and to see them part ways, it was really touching. And Patrick Stewart himself talked about when he was filming that scene that he just broke out in tears, and they had to stop and refilm it because it was emotional for him, and that definitely comes off on screen. You get that really strong emotion between these two close friends, and just makes it a really good film. Anyway, my rating for Star Trek Nemesis out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. The flaws I mentioned, the Jeep chasings, the unnecessary mental rape scenes, and the horrible music, and maybe Data's death could have been handled a bit better, do hold it back from being a 9 or a 10, unfortunately. But I think all the positives far outweigh, and I can't believe, I just don't understand personally. I just don't get it why people hate this film so much, why they trash on it, because the relationship between Shinjan's one of the most dynamic villains. Tom Hardy is amazing. Patrick Stewart and Tom Hardy scenes are absolutely amazing. They totally earned that character. They totally did a great job with the Romulan political intrigue aspect. It was better than is something any Star Trek film has never done before. Is something that was original, like having that political intrigue aspect of it. Well, you could say Undiscovered Country, but that was a bit different. This is more like a different aspect, getting into the Romulans, which we haven't explored yet, and the relationship between Picard and Data. It had that sense of family. Even these other characters who you didn't see much, like Crusher or LaForge or Worf, you still had that sense of family. And of course, bringing Riker and Troy together, getting them married, to finally, it's what I've been wanting to see for a long time. And then, that ending where they have, Picard and Riker say goodbye was very touching. So overall, I think the good overwhelms the bad. And I do think this is the best Next Generation film. And in my top 5 of all Star Trek films. There, I said it. I know everyone disagrees, but whatever. I disagree, and I really don't understand why people hate this film so much. I think it's does have flaws, so 8 out of 10. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek Nemesis. I will be back next week. You can count on it for my coverage of Star Trek 2009. And I know I've talked about this film a lot on my channel already, but I have something special planned for next week. So even if you already knew my opinion on this film, but I do highly recommend not missing that one next week, because yeah, I got something special planned for that. Anyway, that is it for this video. I do many other videos on other Star Trek episodes, films, reviews, cover it all. Also do other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.